Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome for being here today. Welcome for joining us during the symposium. My name is BERENTSEN. I'm your moderator for tonight. I'm a writer, journalist, and policymaker. First of all, thank you to Resort for organizing this symposium, which is very much needed during these times. First things first. We are all deeply shocked by the recent developments in the Ukraine. And I need to read this from paper because I just wrote it. We are very concerned about the consequences of the large-scale hostilities in Ukraine for the inhabitants of the country. To show solidarity and to express sympathy and support, this weekend the task force for the Dutch cultural sector is organizing various activities. If you want, you can donate by PIN via bank at the tables in the back. And all proceeds of the sales of the publication from the Resort, the Boekman Stichting, and from Verlies, the publisher house, will be donated to Giro 555, which is the national help aid for the Netherlands, going directly to funding and the Red Cross organizations helping out in the Ukraine. Going forward, artists in the Ukraine are currently in particular danger because the power of art and culture is a reflective pillar and stimulus for free societies. Many artists and writers are already on the run. Others are trying to strengthen resistance within their means. In many debates on this topic, a problem is revealed that can be observed in many Western European countries. Concrete knowledge about contemporary artistic and thus also political and cultural developments in Eastern and Southeastern Europe are still considered as specialized knowledge, thus being niche or scarce. On my way here from Berlin, I was in a train full of refugees, trying to fit in and wait out the storm diffused across Europe. The necessary sensitivity and sufficient background information for the current situation of the Ukrainian art scene is often lacking. Solidarity is important in a situation, but it is not enough. This is not a fair from my bed show or something far away. This is happening in our country, on our soil, and within our political system. Therefore, we should also act in solidarity. So donate, volunteer, or host. A profound sense of powerlessness prevails, and to honor the victims and all those who suffer under repressive and aggressive leaders and regimes, we would like to ask for a minute of silence. I'll move there. Thank you all. Welcome back. A week ago, it became painfully clear that the freedom and peace is not a given, that it must be questioned and challenged over and over again, that we can have this symposium and these conversations, and that we can think freely about the future and hold our governing bodies accountable for their action is not a given. That is why I'm honored that we can be all together here today and doing just exactly that. Looking deeper into the systems that steer us. Today, taking a top-down approach, we will first listen to a lecture from Sepp, and then there will be two panel discussions in which artists will have the final say, which I think that's very nice for a change, right? The lecture we are about to hear from Sepp Eckenhaussen of Platform BK, which is founded after the historical cuts in 2012, will dive deeper into the historical perspective of the artist's position. And in it, he will activate the public and make proposals for artists. So please pay attention, institutions and policymakers, so that the cultural fields and the autonomy of the creators can continue to exist. Autonomy is a major theme today and a major topic, and it will play an important role in the next two panel discussions. In our first panel, We will discuss the politics of the system with Sepp Eckenhaussen, Quirijn van der Hoge, and here, Joke de Wolf. There's much discussion about the importance of changes within the cultural system and breaking through the status quo. But how? And what do we leave and what do we take with us? In a second panel with, I don't see everyone, but there's 4 artists. Elise Eri, Steven Jouwersma, Esther de Graaf en Dragan, zie ik die ook? Well, he is here somewhere. About the importance of maintaining autonomy in a system that constantly presents you with different challenges and questions. How do you keep your agency? How do you move around in a constantly changing political debate? And how do you deal with it, both personally and collectively? If there are any very extremely important questions during the conversation or the panel, please shout, raise your hand, and contribute. Last but absolutely not least, thanks Pictorite for making this all happen today. And I will now please welcome Sepp on stage with a very warm applause. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, MIRTHE. I will come a little bit closer first, because I have to also do what MIRTHE did and start with addressing what we cannot not address, the situation in Ukraine. Of course, we as Platform BK are also deeply shocked by what is happening and feel a lot of compassion and solidarity with all the victims of the war. And we were thinking, what can we do as a small organization here in the Netherlands working in the arts? We feel quite powerless. I can imagine that that goes for more people in organizations. So we made a little overview on our website, platformbk.nl, where you can see initiatives that are happening right now and how to concretely support those. I also want to say I speak to artists who are not sure if they can make art right now. And I want to say we sometimes forget that economy is not everything, that there are things that are stronger than economy. And we see now that nationalism and aggression can be stronger than economy, but also the power of imagination can be stronger. And we need to foster that power and we need to keep making art. And last but not least, I'm appalled by the racial profiling that we see at the borders right now, and we need to stand in solidarity with all refugees. It's heartwarming to see how welcomed the people from Ukraine are right now, but we cannot forget there are people starving and freezing at other parts of the European border, and we need to also have solidarity with those and act in solidarity with those. Yeah, and it feels a little bit weird to now just move to the actual lecture, but this is too big to address, so I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm also convinced that what we talk about today is also very important and will be important in the coming years. So bear with me in this transition, and I'll go sit down and install myself and start the lecture. Right. So, am I visible and audible? All right? Yeah. I wanted to start to maybe get to know you also a little bit, to see who is here together. And my first question is, who of you is registered as a freelancer, as a ZZP'er at the Chamber of Commerce? Okay. Yeah, that seems about representative of the cultural sector. A safe estimate of Boekman Stichting is that 60% of the people in the cultural sector work as a freelancer. In the visual arts, I heard estimates of up to 90%. And Right, okay. This is what we're fighting against, right? Just to put the urgency out there. This is what we're acting against, right? How many of you would work for free also with an institution if it fits in your artistic practice? More than half, right? 75% maybe. I think this is one thing that is also showing the urgency of what why we're here today. So much unpaid labor and underpaid labor. And I want to read to you a small citation from Rosalind Gill, written already in 2009. What are we to make of someone who says they love their work and cannot imagine doing anything they enjoy more, yet earn so little that they can never take a holiday, let alone afford insurance or a pension? How are we to think of a person who is passionate about their creative work and do up to 80 hours of work per week, and yet feel fearful that what they do that they will not be able to have the children they long for because of the time and money pressures they face? So as I understand, we are here together, as MIRTHE also beautifully introduced, to discuss three main topics: artistic autonomy, trust in the artist as a professional, and the quality of artistic production. And I was invited to give a lecture with historical perspectives as basis of the conversations that we will have. That's actually the first time that I've been invited to give a historical lecture, and I'm trained as an art historian. That's very nice. But it's also not so weird that it's the first time that I was invited, because even though I studied art history, I now work as a researcher at the Institute of Network Cultures, and I work as a co-director at Platform BK, and we're dealing mainly or only with contemporary art. And I'm here now today on behalf of Platform BK, where what we do is quite nicely stated here. We take action for better art policy and represent everyone working in the arts. So what we do includes actions, debates, publications, lobby, policy discussions, and we love public events like these where we get to interact also with people that we work with every day. So yeah, I wanted to start with thanking Ellen and Het Resort for inviting me here. I want to state that what I'm saying is not just coming from my mind, it's also coming out of larger conversations that I've been having over the past years with several people, but I want to mention Geert Lovink, Koen Bartijn, and Joram Krijeveld for the many conversations about the state of the arts and what solidarity can be today and tomorrow. So yeah, I think it's an honor that I can be here and speak, but it's a common effort as well. Just wanted to show this here. This is one action that we did as Platform BK at the start of the pandemic in 2020. Remember how Rutte started saying in the first lockdown how everyone that did essential labor was a hero, from the shelf clerks in the supermarket to healthcare personnel? Well, we wanted to ask, how much does a hero earn? Because we can say that you're a hero, but if you're underpaid, then it's really hard to keep doing your heroic work. And we can see here the different groups. So from the left to the right, it's shelf clerk, artist, and I can't even read myself in between. There's a teacher, there's a policeman, and journalist, and then we have the high ones, which are the Prime Minister and the CEO of KLM. And online we have a version where you also have the CEO of Bol.com, or of Booking.com, but we couldn't even erect a statue of 30 meters high, so we had to stop it here. So we are a member-based organization, which means that we can be independent or only dependent on the donations of our members, which is quite nice. So I want to also thank our members and give them a little shout out. So, history. Why would we talk about history? We can see, I guess, that things are in motion in the arts. With the digital economy, cryptocurrencies, NFTs coming up, the pandemic, changing structures, the budget cuts already some years ago that changed the artistic practice in some ways. And some claim that the golden eras are gone, and maybe they're right, but I don't think that nostalgia will get us very far. But I would like to see how the narrative that we use to describe art and the role of art change so that we can understand where we are today. Because that's what it's ultimately about, right? What does it mean to be an artist today? How can you survive and have structures to survive while making the things that you want to make? How can we organize? How can we change? How can we transform the structures that we're living in? So today, the program is about the artist in the neoliberal society. And I will discuss specifically, as the title also said, the rise and fall of social art history, because I believe that the fall of social art history is coinciding with the rise of neoliberalism in Dutch policy. So understanding that history will also help us to understand the current position. I will do so in a structure of 4 chapters. Maybe a bit much, but I'll try to rush through it. First, as I said, the history of social art policy in the Netherlands. Secondly, the question, okay, what does that mean for what we say autonomy? When we say autonomy, what does that mean today? Then I will briefly also discuss the development and rise of fair practice. And I will finish with some dreams of post-precarity or future perspectives that will help us to take ownership and agency and move on. So, the history of social art policy in the Netherlands. To understand where we are now, we have to go back to just after the Second World War and look at the time that the Dutch welfare state was built. So this was a time where the government understood that in order to rebuild the society after the war, it had to support certain, what we now call precarious groups. We got general health care, we got welfare for the unemployed, so bijstand. By the way, how many people here do not speak Dutch? Okay, I might throw in some Dutch words every now and then for Dutch people. Hope that's fine. So bijstand, AOW, so pension for the elderly, scholarships for students, STUFI. And even artists were then recognized as an important social group that could use some financial support. And under the pressure of the BBK, so the Professional Association of the Visual Arts, artists, the Ministry of Social Affairs, so not of Cultural Affairs, but of Social Affairs, rolled out the contraprestatieregeling in 1949, as you can see here behind me, which is so much as the counter-performance scheme, which was then in later years replaced by the famous BKR, Visual Arts Scheme, in 1956, that lasted for several decades. And under this regulation, it did pretty much what it said, so you get something like a basic. I mean, has any one of you ever heard of the history where artists in the Netherlands used to get something like a basic income? If so, then this is it. And you would get kind of an uitkering, so a welfare, and in return, every now and then you would give one artwork to the government. And how would that work in practice? Well, you would go to your municipal council, and we see one of those examples here from 1980, so in the later years of the visual arts scheme, and you would show your art and you would be judged if you were artist enough, and if so, then you would get your money. Here another one where you can see the art being examined by a commission. And in this way, more and more artists went into the BKR, as they called it, over 5,700 in total. And the state collected many, many works. They were over 220,000 at some point, out of which they still have over 40,000 today. And yeah, I mean, you could ask what kind of art was collected. Actually, I think that is not really the point, because it was a social arrangement, right? So it was an acknowledgement of a social function, and mainly the art that was collected was only ever collected like this in a depot. But if you are interested, I do have a book here. If you come to me later, you can flip through it and you can see a monument for the BKR, so a monument for the BKR. You can see what kind of art was collected. So the BKR at some point was just costing too much, and the storage was too difficult to maintain. And governments in the 1970s started discussing to cut down on this arrangement. In 1979, artists actually occupied the Rembrandtzaal of the Rijksmuseum to protest the cut, and they were successful. But then finally in 1984, the money was redistributed to several funds with the idea that in order to professionalize the arts, they would pull the money directly from the artist and put it into funds, and then redistribute it through institutions with the idea, okay, then the most attractive or the most professional artists will surface that way. And then later, and then at some point in 1992, the arrangement was cut completely, and artists could get normal welfare, bijstand, was the idea. Then it turned out in the years after that they didn't really do that. Some municipalities would just give their artists welfare anyway, and they made the WIC, the Wet Inkomensvoorziening Kunstenaars, in which artists could now not in return for art, but just get a bit of a basic income or a bijstand for some years at the start of their career, so with the idea that they could start up their entrepreneurial business. So that's actually where you see the idea of cultural entrepreneurship coming in for the first time officially. So after 1984, it was professionalization. After 1999, it was also entrepreneurship that entered the scene. In 2005, the WIC was transformed into the WWII, even a little bit more restrictive, but by and large the same. And then in 2012, we will come to discuss it later a bit more, the arrangement with the scheme was cut completely. And yeah, so what was the idea behind, so I'm sketching now really the rough image, right? And we can go into the details a bit later, but I'm trying to give you the general sense of what was the idea behind why to support artists like this, and what can we learn from that today. Well, I guess that the idea behind it was a kind of a combination between social income policy after the World War and the Enlightenment ideal that civilization exists by the grace of art, and art must therefore be funded and to be autonomous, to be able to fulfill the social objective of elevation of the people. And even ministers in the Cold War period said that the BKR functioned as an anti-communist awareness campaign, basically. We can see during the years that these arrangements became more and more restrictive, and the simple reason was the out-of-control practical and financial burdens, but also that the political climate changed and criticism in the public debate swelled. You know, lazy artists, why are they getting the money without doing anything in return? And this just made the status of art as a public good less and less obvious over time. So I just wanted to also discuss briefly, how did people think about the BKR at the time? So if you read the literature from the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, you can see clearly that even within the art world, the sentiments had turned against social art policy. And increasingly, the criticism was directed at the exceptional status of the artist and the major role of public institutions in the arts. I'm going to get up and show one more book. In 1997, Ricky Simons wrote De Gijzeling van de Beeldende Kunst, so the entrapment or the captivity of the visual arts, which is kind of a very strong critique of the publicly funded visual arts system, in which she pretty much argues that the state has a monopoly over the visual arts and doesn't even give private parties a chance to enter into the debate or enter into the sector and deploy its own activities. Yeah, she said the government was far too meddlesome in keeping cultural temples, so the institutions afloat, and scientists and scholars were creating high thresholds around that. So, you know, science or scholars and public funds or public bodies were working together against private actors or the market. So with the help of science, they monopolized the art sector, the visual art sector, Simons said. And Sven Luteken, who was already then a critic, is still now a professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, in a review of this book immediately remarked that Simons' ideas about the oppressed blessings of the market were quite romantic. Because were private investors really eager to sponsor culture, but then not being a chance by the government? How does that exactly work? And another interesting author that I'll show another book of had interesting things to say about this. René Steenbergen is a Dutch journalist, researcher, and patronage expert, so mecenaatsdeskundige, and published her book, The New Mecenas, The New Patron, in 2008. And in it, she argued that visual arts could and should benefit more from the culture of giving. So people with a lot of money that are willing to give, but don't give to the visual arts right now. And this thought, I guess, fits in a general tendency to focus more on private funding. But René Steenbergen is very clear in formulating a warning for governments, which is a very simple truth. Private patrons are not interested in filling the gaps left behind by the government, right? So they don't want to invest in bricks and in upkeep and all the things that you need to run. They want to invest in the purchase of a new Rembrandt. So there is different roles, and in order to attract private funders, you need actually to be very clear about what are the different roles for public and for private money. Because we have seen that the role of money has grown in the recent decades. We see more crowdfunding, we see more matching, we see more philanthropy, but we can say 30 years onwards that private money hasn't filled the gap that public money left behind. At the beginning of the century, however, this realization had not really sunk in yet, and the call for tough but necessary cuts, or realism, and entrepreneurship was increasingly heard even within the institutional art world. For instance, yeah, I think the prime example, one more book, that's all. The prime example is this, Second Opinion, which is a book of essays in which, oh, sorry. Fragility of art. In which a lot of important critics of in the cultural system wrote a critique of how things were being done at the moment. And it's, yeah, so the subtitle is Over Beeldende Kunstsubsidie in the Netherlands. So about visual art subsidies in the Netherlands. It was published by Fonds BKVB, which, by the way, got a lot of the funding that was retracted from the artists in 1984. Together with the Mondriaan Foundation, so the predecessor of the Mondriaan Fonds, and WWII publishers, so Dutch Architecture Institute publishers. And yeah, it had like a wide range of different critiques. But the starting point of this publication was that, and I quote, that the subsidy policy in the Netherlands promotes mediocre rather than good art, that Dutch art lacks real urgency, and that the system maintains an enclave that has placed itself outside of reality and of the public. So the idea was that by giving artists this kind of privilege, just giving them money, you would actually create mediocre art production. And to top this off, they even suggested that subsidies, despite their well-intentioned efforts, are ultimately counterproductive. Then in a review of this book, Pascal Gille, another cultural critic that you might know, concluded that the subsidy system had been found by these critics to be too democratic, making quality control impossible. And yeah, while reading this, you would almost wonder which idiot ever thought of setting up a social cultural subsidy policy. Well, it did die soon after, so maybe it had some effect. The ultimate death of social art policy happened in the early 2010s, and it coincided with the first Rutte administration and the rise of the creative industries politics. Spurred by the financial crisis of 2007, the famous Secretary of State Halbe Zijlstra of the Liberals, remember their visual campaigns at the time, was given the task of implementing massive cutbacks of 200 million euros on the budget of culture. And he was going precisely against that what René Steenbergen had said. The government cut down on public funding for culture, hoping that it would give way for a for-profit art sector to arise. Zijlstra quite enthusiastically applied himself to the demolition work, and a painful detail in that was that the Secretary of State claimed that he did not know anything about arts and culture and saw that as an advantage. There was cutting to be done, and feelings of sympathy would only get in the way. So he said he did what he said he would do, and in like a survey that we did at the time at Platform BK shows that 51 cultural institutions were forced to close their doors, 11 of them merged, and 19 continued in a different way, becoming smaller, going online, nomadic, you know it. So some of you will probably remember that there was also a lot of public outrage at the time, so the Schreeuw om Cultuur, Mars voor Beschaving, but in hindsight we have to admit that those were not very effective, so I won't go into them too deeply right now. Instead, I will focus on another element, which is the rise of the creative industries, which is somehow a direct effect of the fact that intrinsic appreciation of art, or social appreciation of art, had sunk to an all-time low, and instead there was a focus on the increasingly instrumental value of culture. Culture as a means to provide social and economic issues with a creative solution, and a lucrative one if possible. Focused on impact more, focused on entertainment more. Some of you might remember the Art of Impact, so an arts fund for everyone except for artists. And the most obvious consequence of this instrumental thinking was the rise of the creative industry in the Netherlands, in which there were buzzwords like diversification, participation, cultural entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship entered before, but this is really the moment where cultural entrepreneurship came to the rise, so the early 2010s. Even the whole subsidy system was overhauled, giving birth to the Stimuleringsfonds Creatieve Industrie. And the creative industries was declared one of the top sectoren in the top sector, or top industries policy, which paved the way for a variety of innovative cultural practices in which anything was possible as long as it included enough creative entrepreneurship, digitization, design thinking, 21st century skills, and social impact. So in short, the Netherlands went in search of a for-profit cultural sector of which the possibility had already been proven in the United Kingdom under Blair in the 1990s. So it's safe to say that over the past 50 years or so, the role of art from a societal perspective has changed quite radically. From a part of the welfare state that was valued on social and cultural grounds to a lucrative sector focused on entertainment, impact, and innovation. But where does that leave the idea of autonomy? Well, the first thing that we should notice, and I saw it even in the train when we were coming here in some advertisement for an exhibition, is that we haven't stopped using the notion of artistic autonomy, right? Some people might be critical of it, but it still comes up in all kinds of conversations all the time. Artists are very fond, and rightly so, of being free to engage in the artistic process, to think critically, to make beautiful things, or to hold up a mirror to society. And I think it's really safe and fair to say that there is no freedom, there is no art without freedom. And also there's this idea that there is, you don't become an artist before the financial gains, right? But because you pursue your dream, you have to fulfill your vocation, therefore you kind of accept to be poor. And this is what Hans Abbing in his book, Why Are Artists Poor, calls the art ethos. In order to be a real artist, you don't have to care about money. Otherwise, you're not a real artist. But what it meant to be autonomous, if we look again from a more societal or sociological perspective, it really did change quite a lot. Whereas artistic autonomy in the welfare state was a privileged position based on, or facilitated by the state and based on intrinsic and social appreciation, the term now implies rather a game or your individual position in regard to the market, right? We no longer have a semi-automatic inclusivity of the BKR that allowed artists to do what they wanted, or at least in the WIC for the first time, for the first year after graduating, and actually a scheme that trusted artists to do what they do well. In that time, it wasn't really necessary to think as an artist about your business model. And today, whether you want it or not, you have to think about making money somehow. And sometimes maybe our teachers don't still seem to grasp this, but it's true. So crudely put, artistic autonomy today, up for discussion, but I'll say it here, means you can have your autonomous practice as long as you maintain it yourself by whatever means. So you can sell your art, you can decide to live with very little money, you can get a side job. In any case, you can have an autonomous practice if you also have a lucrative practice. So we should also dive a little bit deeper into the relation between creative industries and the arts today. So you could say, I'm an autonomous artist, my work has nothing to do with for-profit creative industries, and of course there is a difference, but there's also two things that we have to keep in mind. First, creative entrepreneurship is closer to high art than we may think. It is completely normal by now to have, or normalized even from the government, to have a hybrid practice, which means even the line of the ministry is you don't have to make all your money in the cultural sector as long as the money that you make is made according to fair pay principles or fair practice principles. So they actually assume that you will probably have multiple sources of income. And we know that artists are side jobbers as teachers or as house painters or in the service industry, horeca. But they also increasingly are programmers or advisors or advertisers. And because of this tendency, in reality, it means that artistic practices have become more dependent upon creative entrepreneurship. Second thing we shouldn't forget is that the creative industry's ideology is certainly present in how the government makes decisions with regard to the arts. Saying that you're an autonomous artist doesn't dismiss you from the individual responsibility to be an economically healthy citizen in this society. Whether you want it or not, an artist today ought to be an entrepreneur. So, two examples. Maybe all of you remember that at the start of the COVID crisis, Minister Wiebes, so the Minister of Economic Affairs, said, well, we're not going to give freelancers any subsidy because they decided to be an entrepreneur, so they willingly took the risk, right? So, I mean, obviously this doesn't fly for the cultural sector because most of you maybe haven't even consciously chosen to be an entrepreneur. It's just the only way to go about it, make money and do your practice. In any case, you are considered an entrepreneur. A second example. Second example I wanted to mention quickly, and we'll go into this later maybe a bit deeper, is when the implementation of the Fair Practice Code took place, and it was embraced by our previous Minister of Culture, Ingrid van Engelshoven. She said, you have to implement it, but I'm not going to give you the funding to go with it, right? So you have to arrange this with yourself, with the market. It has been calculated that we would need 200 million euros for that per year to keep up the same level of artistic production or cultural production with the fair pay principle. In any case, that does bring me to the development of fair practice. We all know, right, the problems of the current situation. There's all these kind of excuses not to pay or to underpay artists or other cultural workers, producers. It's great for your network, you have a chance to sell your work, it's a great visibility, it will give you so many more chances, and it will be great in your CV, but we can't pay you at all. So this kind of also came into the scope of policymakers. In 2016, after extensive research, the Dutch Council for Culture and the Socio-Economic Council together, in this report, concluded that the labor market situation in the cultural sector is worrying. Pretty much an understatement, but right. This was an important moment since it really shows a shift in policy direction. The councils jointly took a close look at the cultural labor market, and their findings were pretty alarming. They saw structural underpayment, lack of security, excessive flex work, and all the other problems that we know, but that now were also actually made tangible in a report and therefore understandable in policy terms. In response, the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science had the labor market agenda for the cultural sector 2017-2023 drawn up, so extensive policy document with 21 recommendations to achieve a better functioning labor market in the cultural sector. Long story short, 4 years on, the outcomes of this process are pretty significant. We have Platform Act with a funky design. The cultural sector with this platform has an official sector-wide labor market platform for policy discussions about the labor market, hopefully paving the way for the development of a collective labor agreement, as a large part of the cultural sector still doesn't have that. Also, yeah, so this is the labor market agreement. The Arbeidsmarkt Agenda conference, maybe it's good to say that all of these conversations were also had with partners in the field. Also, Noordenaars, including Het Resort and Platform WWII, together organized the Fair Practice Symposium recently, because this is actually very important from this development of a new labor market policy for us today, is that there were 3 codes drawn up in response to the labor market agenda: the Code Diversity and Inclusion, the Code Good Governance, and the Fair Practice Code. I mean, I assume that you all heard of those, because in order to get any funding as of 2020 from the government, you need to comply with all 3 of these codes. So, moreover, important for us is that the Fair Practice Code includes compliance with the guideline for artist fees, which was developed by the field, with, among other partners, by Platform WWII. This was the official body that still is developing it. And I guess, how many of you have never worked with the calculator? How many of you have worked with the calculator of the... Okay, too few. Then maybe at the end we can draw it up on the screen and discuss it together. But in any case, it kind of makes it tangible how you can make sure not to be underpaid for doing an exhibition as an artist. And the icing of the cake was that this policy trend was actually embraced by the Minister of Culture, as I said before, in 2020. So you cannot no longer get government funding without paying an artist a fee or accounting for their accessibility of the programs or any other things relating to these 3 codes. But there is an obvious tension that arises here that I also mentioned before, is that she didn't decide to give the funding that was needed to comply. So yeah, probably we'll also discuss this later. But this kind of puts in perspective, you have seen probably that in the new coalition agreement, there is a new investment in culture of 170 million euros. Only complying with fair pay at the current level of cultural production costs 200,000. So there is a large tension there that has to be dealt with in the field. Yeah, this is maybe also illustrating of the... can you read it from the back, or should I read it?